The palace walls have held secrets for decades, but none more explosive than this. For years, whispers hinted at a private recording Diana made in the final months of her life, but no one expected it to resurface now, or that it would be Catherine who revealed it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a quiet, almost clinical statement delivered through a trusted royal aide rippled outward like a shockwave that no institution could contain. In carefully chosen words, Catherine confirmed that a previously unknown recording of Diana existed, and that its contents spoke of betrayal, dignity, and an emotional truth the palace had long tried to bury. The reaction was instant and visceral. Across newsrooms, social feeds, and living rooms around the world, disbelief turned into obsession, curiosity into urgency, and speculation into a relentless storm. Commentators dissected every phrase, analysts replayed every implication, and the public, who had never truly let go of Diana, felt as though her voice had reached across time to speak again. Inside the palace, however, the mood was anything but controlled. Senior staff were reportedly blindsided, scrambling through corridors in hurried whispers, desperately trying to understand how something of this magnitude had slipped beyond their grasp. Meetings were called, then cancelled, then called again. Lines of authority blurred as courtiers argued over damage control, while others quietly panicked at what this could mean for the monarchy's carefully curated image. And at the centre of that unease stood Queen Camilla, said by insiders to be deeply unsettled, her composure strained beneath the weight of a revelation she had never anticipated. Catherine, meanwhile, remained deliberately distant. No grand press conference, no emotional appeal, no dramatic justification. Only a single, measured line that echoed louder than any speech ever could. Some truths choose their moment. In that phrase lay both restraint and defiance, humility and power, compassion and consequence. It suggested that this was not an act of vengeance, but a reckoning, one that had been waiting patiently for the right time to surface. Yet, beneath the calm exterior of Catherine's silence, there was an unmistakable tension. By choosing to speak, even in fragments, she had cracked open a door that could never be fully closed again. The monarchy, built on control, secrecy, and carefully managed narratives, now faced something far more dangerous than scandal, the raw return of a voice it had once tried to quiet. And as the world leaned in, eager, anxious, and divided, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a much deeper story. To understand the weight of this revelation, we must return to a forgotten chapter when Diana's voice was almost silenced forever. In the twilight of her public life, Diana was anything but naive. Surrounded by flashing cameras and closed doors, she knew her words were being watched, but not all of them were meant for the public. One, in particular, was kept for the day she'd no longer be able to speak for herself. It was during this final, turbulent phase, when Diana stood both revered and increasingly isolated, that she began recording her deepest reflections, not for public consumption, but as a safeguard. Friends close to her recall hushed late-night conversations where she spoke candidly of future threats, of betrayals waiting in the wings, and of the invisible war being waged behind palace curtains. These were not the fears of a woman losing control, these were the calculated decisions of someone determined to preserve her truth. For every televised smile and scripted statement, there existed another layer, a quiet rebellion recorded in private. It wasn't just about survival. Diana was consumed by the idea of legacy. Those who sat with her during those last months say she fixated on setting the record straight, a phrase she returned to often, like a drumbeat. Her concern, she once said, was not how history would remember her, but how it might lie about her. And so, as the pressures mounted and her circle tightened, she did the only thing left to her. She began speaking to a recorder, laying out her thoughts, her fears, and yes, her warnings. One of those tapes, it turns out, held the name Camilla. This revelation didn't come from the tabloids or the royal rumour mill, it came from those Diana trusted most. Quiet nods in interviews, offhand comments in memoirs, a moment remembered, then confirmed, by someone who had once been in the room when Diana pressed the record button and said, "This is for them to hear when I no longer can." That tape, they now believe, was recorded just months before her passing, during a period when Diana seemed both more fragile and more fearless than ever before. The implications are profound. It wasn't just a woman venting into the void, it was a mother building a message for the future, aware that her voice might be the only defense her sons would have in a palace where truth was currency and silence, survival. And as the years passed and the monarchy reshaped itself, that tape didn't disappear. It waited, hidden, sealed, protected by someone no one suspected. But the tape didn't vanish, it was hidden, sealed, and protected by someone no one suspected. The world assumed the tape was lost in the fog of tragedy, but someone close to Diana held onto it not for leverage, but for legacy. And now, that person has stepped forward, with Catherine by their side. For years, silence reigned over the late princess's most private relics. Boxes stored away, labelled only with initials or cryptic tags, long believed to have been catalogued, lost, or quietly discarded as the monarchy sought to rebuild itself after her death. But one box never entered official archives. One box remained in the care of someone not mentioned in memoirs or televised tributes, a royal housekeeper whose loyalty ran deeper than duty. She had served Diana in quieter years, not as a face of protocol, but as a witness to grief, to resilience, and to fear. And it was to her Diana entrusted something irreplaceable. For over 2 decades, that housekeeper told no one, not even her closest family, of what she protected, not out of fear, but reverence. It wasn't her story to share. Not yet. But as the years passed, as Catherine began to carry the legacy of Diana's grace and resolve with increasing weight, their paths crossed not through official channels, but through a quiet foundation event where names weren't traded but trust was. A slow relationship formed. Conversations, letters, an understanding. Catherine had become more than the Princess of Wales. To the housekeeper, she had become the woman Diana had written for. The decision to hand over the box didn't come with ceremony. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, with no palace aides present. Only a small velvet bundle. Only the note. Only the weight of time pressing down. When Catherine opened the box, her fingers trembled. Not because of scandal, but because of what it meant to hear Diana speak again. When the tape was played, when Diana's voice filled the room, warm, composed, unmistakable, it wasn't rage Catherine heard. It was sorrow. It was truth, unburdened by press. It was a mother explaining what she feared and why it could not be forgotten. Catherine didn't weep at first. She sat, still, letting every word shape the resolve already blooming in her. It was about protection, about understanding that sometimes legacy doesn't whisper, it roars, but only when the right person is ready to listen. And Catherine was ready. The tape hadn't been forgotten, it had been waiting for her. But what did Diana actually say, and why does it strike so painfully close to the present? Shaky but resolute, Diana's voice cuts through time like a blade. She speaks not with bitterness, but clarity, and in her words, Camilla's shadow looms larger than ever before. As the tape plays, the room stills. There is no dramatic crescendo, no performative grief, only the unmistakable sound of a woman who knew her place in history was being rewritten before her eyes. Diana's voice, soft but unwavering, begins, "I know what they've taken." The phrase lingers, haunting. She doesn't name Camilla directly, but the implication is undeniable. She was always in the room, Diana continues, referencing moments long speculated upon but never confirmed. Her words don't drip with anger. Instead, they carry the solemn weight of someone who bore betrayal not as scandal, but as survival. She speaks of William and Harry, of emotional fractures she feared would deepen over time if left unhealed. "They must know who stood for them, even when I wasn't allowed to speak," she says, almost as if reaching through time to ensure her sons one day understood the choices made on their behalf. But it's what she says next that sends shockwaves through the monarchy. "I pray the women who come after me never have to barter with silence to keep the peace." Dignity must not cost your soul. It's not an indictment, it's a legacy, laid bare with surgical precision. Experts listening to the recording describe it as not rage, but release. A testimony not born out of vengeance, but preservation. A reckoning with reality, shaped by years of pain, but aimed at freeing those who came after. And Catherine, now the custodian of this voice, understands that. She doesn't weaponize the tape. She lets it breathe. And yet, the moment its transcript is leaked, likely by an independent journalist close to royal aides, the media explodes. Headlines spin out of control. Questions are asked that the palace isn't ready to answer. Was this Diana's final warning? Had the monarchy buried not just a voice, but a warning meant to change everything? Camilla's camp remains quiet, but sources whisper of intense frustration. Charles is reportedly blindsided. For the firm, it is more than a PR crisis. It is a ghost from the past, forcing the present to answer for what it never resolved. But the palace scrambles to contain the fallout, but Catherine isn't finished. Why now? Why Catherine? According to insiders, the Princess of Wales faced a quiet war, and Diana's voice became her final compass. Behind the polished smiles and royal photo calls, tension had begun to swell within the palace walls. Sources close to the royal household speak of a subtle but escalating conflict between Catherine and Camilla, one that rarely erupted in public, but grew sharper in private. The final tipping point reportedly came when Camilla began asserting influence over access to the children Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. What began as small comments, occasional suggestions, and quiet interventions evolved into something Catherine could no longer ignore. Family protocol was being used as a tool of power, and Catherine felt its cold edge. In the midst of this storm, Catherine found herself increasingly alone in royal corridors, where once she was celebrated as the family's bridge to the future. Some senior aides began to distance themselves. Others whispered their loyalties in closed-door meetings. The burden was isolating. But then came the tape. Diana's voice, calm, wounded, and unyielding, shifted something deep within her. Catherine didn't just hear a mother speak about betrayal. She heard a warning, a plea, a blueprint, not for revenge, but for resilience. And it was in that moment, royal watchers say, that Catherine stopped asking for space and started reclaiming it. Privately, she turned to William. The conversation between them, by all accounts, was brief. No heated arguments, no elaborate plans. Just a look, a nod, a shared understanding that silence was no longer strength, it was surrender. So, when the statement was made about the tape's existence, Catherine knew exactly what she was doing. It was not an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of defense. Not just for herself, but for her children. For the legacy Diana had hoped to protect. And for the quiet truth too long buried under layers of ceremony. But not everyone in the family agreed, and one figure, in particular, pushed back harder than anyone expected. Sources say Camilla's reaction to the tape was anything but composed. Behind palace curtains, her fury burned through decorum and threatened to ignite a deeper fracture within the firm. In the hours following the tape's exposure, Camilla reportedly convened a flurry of closed-door meetings. Her fury, some insiders claim, wasn't just about what Diana had said, but when and how it had been released. The timing, the tone, the messenger, every detail felt personal. Catherine, once viewed as a steady, apolitical figure within the family, had crossed a line Camilla never expected her to. And now, it wasn't just a matter of royal image, it was about survival within the institution. Almost immediately, Camilla's inner circle moved to question the tape's validity. Quiet inquiries were made into whether the audio could be doctored, whether the source had been manipulated, whether the press had fallen prey to a forgery. But behind the scenes, many in the palace weren't convinced this strategy would hold. Too many had heard Diana speak in life to deny the voice in death. Too many saw the tape not as fiction but as a final truth, long buried. Caught in the storm was Charles. The king, visibly worn by recent tensions, reportedly held back from intervening. Those closest to him say he was paralyzed by the weight of two legacies, his loyalty to Camilla and the echo of Diana's voice now reverberating louder than ever before. While Camilla's allies demanded a swift response, many senior aides hesitated. The firm was split. Should they protect the Queen's dignity or acknowledge the tape and weather the storm? This divide seeped into planning rooms and scheduling briefings. At least 2 major public engagements were altered last minute. Internally, senior staff began walking on eggshells. What should have been a simple rebuttal or clarification ballooned into a full-blown crisis. The sense of unity the monarchy had been desperately working to rebuild was once again in question this time, not because of scandal from outside, but because of truth from within. Yet even as chaos brewed behind the gates, the public made their feelings resoundingly clear. The people hadn't forgotten Diana, and now they were hearing her again. Streets, screens, and social feeds erupted in a tide of remembrance. But it wasn't just nostalgia, it was a reckoning. Within hours of the tape's content surfacing, the world ignited. On every platform, Diana's voice echoed with chilling clarity. The hashtags #DianaSpeaks and #JusticeForDiana surged to the top of global trends. Commentators, journalists, and historians, many of whom had long debated Diana's legacy in quiet retrospection, now spoke with renewed conviction. This was not just a moment of tribute. This was a seismic shift. Crowds formed outside Kensington Palace. Some came with flowers. Others brought handwritten letters. Candles flickered in the shadows of statues erected in Diana's name, as if her presence had finally returned in the most unexpected way. But this wave wasn't born out of spectacle, it was rooted in vindication. For decades, the narrative surrounding Diana's final years had been blurred by formality, spin, and silence. Now, her own words had cut through the noise. Public figures began weighing in. Analysts called the release a correction of record. Emotional editorials described it as a necessary catharsis. And in the heart of it all stood Catherine, stoic, measured, and suddenly transformed in the eyes of millions. Where once she had been seen as composed, she was now heralded as courageous. She hadn't just shared a recording, she had upheld a voice that history tried to bury. Polls taken just days after the tape's reveal painted a stark picture. Support for Catherine soared across all age brackets. Even those traditionally loyal to the firm expressed sympathy and admiration. Camilla, on the other hand, found herself navigating a firestorm. Scheduled appearances were postponed without explanation. One speech was quietly pulled from a charity event with no replacement speaker. Public sentiment was shifting rapidly, and the Crown felt it. The monarchy, always cautious of emotion becoming louder than protocol, found itself on the defensive. The public wasn't merely listening, they were responding. And this response was personal. For many, it wasn't about royal hierarchy or duty anymore. It was about memory, loyalty, and truth. Diana's voice had returned, and Catherine's decision had given it the volume no palace statement ever could. But even as the world listened to Diana's voice, another voice was preparing to speak, one no one expected. For days, he said nothing. But when William finally spoke, it wasn't just as a prince, it was as a son. And what he said left the nation in stunned silence. In a statement barely longer than a paragraph, William shattered the royal tradition of cautious neutrality. It read simply, "She was right." 3 words. Yet in those 3 words, the weight of decades came crashing down. The world knew exactly who he meant. Diana, his mother, his compass. His acknowledgement wasn't a political maneuver, nor a media strategy. It was personal, and it was powerful. For years, William had walked a careful line, balancing public duty with private grief. But this was something else. With Catherine by his side and the ghost of his mother finally heard, he chose to speak, not as an heir to the throne, but as the child of a woman who had been silenced too long. He didn't name Camilla. He didn't need to. He made no accusations, issued no demands. but the silence between the lines thundered louder than any condemnation. In backing Catherine's decision to share the tape, William had made it clear: the next generation would not be bound by the same codes of silence that once cost their family dearly. It was a break from the past, a clean, sharp line drawn through decades of spin, loyalty, and unspoken pain. For the public, it was a moment of reckoning. The future king had finally validated the deepest wound in royal memory and Catherine's role in unearthing it. The reaction was immediate. Headlines carried the quote across the globe. Support surged even higher. Royal watchers and insiders alike admitted this wasn't just a gesture, it was a generational pivot. The monarchy's old guard had been shaken, and the heir to the throne had just shown which side of history he was choosing. For Catherine, it was a vindication. For the firm, it was a disruption. For the public, it was a promise that Diana's truth would no longer live in shadows. And just when it seemed the storm might pass, Catherine makes one final move, one that turns revelation into revolution. Catherine could have left it at the tape. She could have walked away. But instead, she chose to act, to immortalize Diana's message in a way no one could ignore ever again. It wasn't a press conference, it wasn't a staged photo op, it was a mission. And it bore a name pulled directly from the recording that changed everything. Barter. With silence. With quiet resolve. Catherine unveiled a new royal initiative, focused entirely on emotional wellness for children born into public life. For too long, the spotlight had been a burden, an unchosen inheritance that demanded obedience, composure, and silence in exchange for status. Diana had spoken of it with sorrow. Catherine now vowed to dismantle it. The program would provide resources for royal and public-facing children to protect their emotional autonomy, their mental clarity, and most of all their right to express pain without shame. It was a radical concept for an institution built on stoicism. And that was the point. What caught many by surprise, however, was the subtle but undeniable signal from the throne itself. Charles, though absent from the announcement, approved quiet funding through a discretionary royal trust. It wasn't a public endorsement, but it wasn't resistance either. For royal watchers, it was a code, a sign that the king, however conflicted, would not block the winds of change. Camilla, on the other hand, remained conspicuously absent. Her name wasn't spoken. Her presence wasn't missed. And yet, her silence said everything. The initiative's rollout swept across the media like a second wave. Commentators from around the world called it bold, timely, necessary. Catherine's approval ratings skyrocketed. But more than that, she was being redefined. No longer simply the quiet Princess of Wales. Now, a force of purpose. A mother rewriting the code of what monarchy could mean in the modern world. Across the globe, schools, advocacy groups, and even fellow royals from other nations expressed interest in adopting the initiative's frameworks. It was no longer just about one recording or one rivalry. It was about legacy. Catherine hadn't just defended Diana's truth. She'd built something from it, something tangible. A structure, a safeguard, a shield for the next generation. For George, for Charlotte, for Louis, for every child who would be asked to smile when they were hurting, to wave when they wanted to run, to speak softly when the world demanded silence. Now, finally, they had a choice. And so, from a voice nearly lost to time, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.